evening. Good to see you here, Chris. Welcome to the January 11th, 2010 work session. Work sessions are a more informal setting to update the council on business items. No vote will be taken on work session items. There are 5 items on our agenda. Public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak, you are required to fill out a public comment card and turn it into the city clerk's staff. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item. Once the item is called, no other public cards will be taken, accepted. Will the city clerk please call the first item?
Item number 1 is revised easement swap, Sally Rich, presented by Mr. Carter Lucas.
Mayor, before we get started on this, we just, Carter asked before here, would you be willing to modify the order of the, agenda to bring, we've got 3 that are real quick, number 1, 3, and 4. Could we get those out of the way and then move into the meatier ones?
Sure. We can go ahead and do that. Everybody else okay with it? Yep. So we're doing 1, 3, and 4?
1, 3, 4, and then we'll move back up to number 2.
Okay.
Is it okay with the audience?
I checked beforehand and he didn't voice any opposition, so.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Back in August, Mayor and Council approved an easement swap for Sally Rich Cobb over on the Crabapple property. For Mr. Longoria's benefit, on the back page of the handout I just gave you is a plat that shows 2 things. One, an existing easement that is dotted. That's the current easement on the property for access over to Sally's piece. And then the dotted piece is the swap. And that's actually the area that is used for access over to that property. So the intent was really to move from an easement that's right, okay. An easement that wasn't usable to one that was. Right. There's some parking, a couple of large trees and things in that old easement. After council approved that, Sally reviewed the easement and had a couple of comments that I wanted to bring back to you all to get some feedback on. And on the second page of that document, items I, and item C were the sections that she was asking to have modified. In those first 2, the original language on the easement, which is what you have now, where it says grantee, that the grantee would perform any work within the easement in a workmanlike manner. She's asking that to be the grantee or the grantor. So either one of us that does work within that easement would have to do so in a workmanlike manner. And I don't know that there should be an issue with that. The other one that she was looking to modify, C that I have highlighted there, was a termination clause for the easement, and she's asked for that to be removed. And I think that was originally in the document to give the city enough flexibility, since we did not have an intended use on that property quite yet, that if something came up in the future and we needed to modify that easement, that we could, or in this case, eliminate the easement completely. Ken and I talked a little bit, and maybe the compromise on that language is that rather than a termination of the easement, that it's worded to be that easement can be modified if necessary in the future. But those were the main things that she was looking at, that she had some issues with the easement document that was originally approved by council.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
I guess what we're hopeful, could I just say what we're hopeful to accomplish with this by bringing it to a work session tonight is we drafted the easement that we thought was represented the city's interest and presented that to Sally. Absent now these challenges that she's made to it, but the next time we bring something forward to you at a council meeting, we want it to be a document that she can live with. Now, we might have already passed that document as far as we're concerned, and it is what it is. But if, based on some of these feedback comments, you're interested in modifying this document to bring back something that maybe Sally would find more attractive to her, that's kind of what we're here hoping to get that information.
Ken, do you want to say anything?
Well, Carter and I did talk about this briefly before the meeting. With respect to item I and double I. I mean, I could see very reasonably that language being modified to say the grantor or grantee as applicable in both of those. That would be fine with me. With respect to C, where grantor shall have the right to terminate the easement, I think just from a standpoint of equity, it would make more sense to not allow us to terminate the easement upon 60 days, but allow us to modify, because theoretically what could occur is we could simply get this document signed, terminate the easement, and she's left with no easement at that point. I could see her resisting that, so.
From a property owner, I guess, was that her angle, that she would rather not have the easement permanent, that could never be terminated? Or?
Well, yeah, she never wants the right to basically forfeit her easement right. She wants to have something there. And what we would be saying is we're not going to terminate it altogether, but we have the right to move it around to give us maximum flexibility on the property. We don't know what we're doing on the property just yet, so we got to give us the ability to move.
So that kind of takes care of both parties on that.
I think so. Yes.
Allows her to have the easement and accessibility, and also the city if we're going to do anything with the other property.
Correct.
Anybody? Bill?
So is she agreeable to substitute and modify?
I haven't presented that to her yet. We just discussed that tonight, so.
Right.
Her request was that the language be eliminated altogether from the easement document.
But see, I think we would have a hard time agreeing to that, because then we are absolutely locked in to having to work around this easement parameters, and we can't do it. So we'll want some flexibility as well.
What did the original easement she had with Fulton County, how did it read as far as this goes?
That's a great question, Councilmember, and I'm not sure what the original verbiage looked like. I don't know, Carter, do you have that language? I don't have it.
And it seems like if Fulton County had granted her an easement, even if we modified it, we couldn't terminate it without there being some kind of legal consequences.
Clearly, there was some flexibility in the original document, or we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this now. So that's a great question. I can look into that, or Carter and I can.
I'm not sure I've seen the original document, but I can look for that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So, would the council be in favor of, with legal opinion and whatnot, Carter going back and talking with Church Bob, see if she's okay with that?
I'm good with all three changes.
So basically, we would bring you back a document that has items 1 and 2 with the modification to allow it being both her and the city would do the work in a workmanlike manner, et cetera. And then on C, we would basically, the functional equivalent would be we would change terminate to modify.
All right, thank you.
Do that.
Can you bring up the offset map?
Okay, any other discussion on that? City clerk, please stay on the next item.
All right, moving to order, we're going to go to item 2, discussion on the use of the MARTA offset funds. Carter, please.
So this is a copy of the memo that we gave out at the December 21st staff report.
By the way, I told Carter how good he looked on TV the other morning, so. On the news.
Try and stay off
Double
camera.
Was he shoveling salt?
Doing their looking report.
Supervising.
Carter's not been at home a lot in the last 72 hours.
The MARTA offset funds, and this, again, this was a document that I handed out at the December 21st council meeting. But MARTA's made available $25 million in funding for the Atlanta region, of which about $6.25 million were designated to North Fulton County and $625,000 to the city of Milton. The funds are intended to provide transit enhancements within a half mile of our bus routes. And so our routes, 140 and 185, are right here in the City Hall area. And what we're intending on doing, the funds are going to be distributed based on the Transportation Improvement Program, our TIP program. And what we've been asked to do is bring forward a list from the City of Milton of potential projects that can be added to the first quarter amendment of the TIP. So that would be done in February or March. That's how the funds will be managed through that program. We've put together a list of projects that we think would qualify for the program and are within a half mile of the 2 bus routes. The list that we have is about little over $1 million in projects. The $625,000 can be used to either completely fund a project or help to fund a project. There's no match on the city's part. It's 100% funding for any of these projects. And what we're hoping to do is next regular council meeting bring forth a resolution with these projects on it. But I wanted to bring this back to see if there had been any thought or we needed to have any further discussion tonight regarding this list before it came back to council in the resolution form. What we've tried to do is really blanket, give a broad description of these projects so we're not locked into anything in particular. But again, they would be sidewalk improvements. It'll be a little bit hard to see on the black and white map that you've got, but the devil lines are sidewalk sections that we've included in our cost estimate. It's really infill of some sidewalk projects throughout that enhancement area. Continuing the lighting along Deerfield from Webb on out to Highway 9. And in that particular case, this project would be able to fund from Webb to approximately Avonsong. That would get us to the half-mile point. If we wanted to continue it on from there, that would be out of city funds. On this, we're guessing probably about $140,000 of the offset funds could be used to get us out to Avonsong, and the remainder would be about $60,000 to get it on out to Highway 9. And then we have a number of ADA upgrades at the intersections that we would be proposing. And we had another one on the list here for bus shelters at selected locations. And we could prioritize that list at any point, but once we get it in the TIP, we then at least have the option of using those funds as we see fit in those particular areas. So I just wanted to see if we had any further feedback from the December 21st meeting that we could incorporate in the resolution coming up.
Thanks, John. At the December 21st meeting, there was a question or a couple questions that were asked relative to the use of the funds for possibly a Highway 9 gateway.
The signage would qualify. There was also a question about land acquisition.
Yeah.
And I've asked the question, and I have not gotten a response back yet.
I would think in terms of priority and needs, I would think that those two things would rise above, especially the pocket parks, land acquisition along Highway 9, would rise above the bus shelters, especially in terms of our needs and in contributing to quality of life for the residents in and around the Highway 9 area or Milton in general. What can we do to get a response on that?
I'll try again to make sure. Land acquisition is not one that is specifically called out in the enabling ordinance on this. So my guess is that in my initial discussions with MARTA, they may be having that same discussion internally to come up with an answer on whether or not it would be a qualifying activity. The difficulty in that is going to be, since we haven't identified any particular parcel in this enhancement area, assigning a cost estimate to it. I guess we could make an estimate, but I'm not aware of any particular parcel that we have looked at or is available.
Of course, with $100,000 dedicated to bus shelters, that very well could be your signage right there.
Absolutely. And we can add.
And acquire a lot of land with $100,000.
And we can add the gateway signage to this list too.
But it's still costing us to have to come up with $300,000 and some odd to bring it all to fruition.
If we did this entire
This
list.
entire list.
Yes, sir.
And you just clarify too, this was something you're kind of going for the gusto of.
That's right. This
See
does
what
not
we'll come back
obligate
with.
us to spend that money, but it allows us to. And so as we work our way down through the priority, if we decide that the lights are the highest priority, and we can work our way down through that and choose sidewalk sections for the funding that we have left, we can always prioritize those. We have probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 6 sidewalk sections shown on there. Those could definitely be prioritized and accomplish those projects as funding is available.
$300,000 on sidewalks instead of 550 and
Yes,
do
sir.
some of the other stuff. I would kind of agree with Alan on maybe the bus shelters might be more of a lower priority item in my mind, and then maybe kind of work to pare down the sidewalks a little bit. But that's just me.
And I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. And just gonna throw it out there because there's a lot of bus shelters on here. How do we keep, if we were to follow through with all these bus shelters, how do we keep the bus shelters from looking like some that are in our surrounding areas? One right up here on Windward and right in front of the Lowe's. That there's a couple turned over shopping carts there that serve as a table half the time. I mean, they look really run down. I'm fearful of putting that many bus stops, shelters in this area. I really am.
Well, from an overall design standpoint on the bus shelters, I've been told that MARTA will work with us to make them what we need them to be. They have a standard design, which is what this cost is based off of, that they use. They've got a new design that they think is pretty nice. I have not seen it yet. That must be a little bit different from the shelters that they do now. The variable in cost there is based on advertising. If you allow advertising on the bus shelter, it's a lower cost. If you don't, it's a higher cost. And then as you add to it, the cost for the shelter would go up if we have things that we want as the city of Milton.
Related to that same issue there, who eventually owns the shelters and who maintains them?
MARTA does, to the best of my knowledge. But
Are they
I'll find that out.
in the public's right?
They are in the right-of-way.
And also, are there requirements to have the bus shelters there or not?
There is no requirement to have the bus shelter.
I don't know if that was a hot button or something that they wanted to.
So basically, MARTA is getting us to spend grant money on something that they may have to do eventually anyway?
If we wanted to do it as part of this program, yes, sir. Typically, I think they have a program. Well, they will build the bus shelters if requested by the community. I don't know if they have a program where they proactively go out and do it if not requested by the community. But we put that on the list just so that we would have the option, if that was something we decided to do in the future, we would be able to do it under this funding.
But I guess what you're saying, that we can pick and choose these numbers. Obviously, we may not get all this money. We wouldn't have to spend $100,000 on bus shelters.
That's right.
We could shift that over to sidewalks if we felt at the time.
That's right.
Lighting or
You
whatever
could-
was more important. And in the meantime, if we felt or citizen output, was that we needed shelters, you could do some of them, possibly.
Right.
Wouldn't be required to do them all.
The goal would be to get the projects that we think we need to do on this list now, and we can move dollars around as we need to. Once it's in the tip and approved, then we have the flexibility to move between projects. We won't be locked into these particular dollars.
My preference would be to spend the money on items that weren't going to be paid for in any other way. The street lights, I think would be very good. The signage, streetscape for a gateway entrance, I think would be something that would be very noticeable. Sidewalks in areas where if developed, the developer wouldn't be having to put them in areas maybe that was developed so long ago, the sidewalks weren't required, would be good. If it's an area that might be developed in the next year or two and the developer would have to change and put in the sidewalks anyway, I think I'd rather use the money elsewhere. And then maybe one or two bus shelters, but I'll tell you, if Marta's the one that's maintaining them, I'd prefer to have no bus shelters. Some of the ones that I've seen that they have been maintaining.
I'll confirm that maintenance with the MARTA folks too.
Mechanics of how this funding works, are they gonna go ahead and transfer that to our account immediately, or is it on a as completed basis?
It's a reimbursable as it stands right now.
Say again, the economic situation that they're in, the financial situation that they're in. Let's say we go ahead and start doing something like that.
Carter, are the ADA upgrades in the intersections where you're proposing that, or where we're proposing that, are those intersections connected to some place where people who could benefit from those upgrades would have access? In other words, I want to make sure we're not upgrading an intersection that doesn't have any sidewalks already going to it, or wouldn't have access otherwise, because then the upgrades are sort of not being utilized. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
And I apologize, I don't know the answer to that question already.
And I want to say, yes, they will be. I'm looking at the map to see if there's any that won't, but
So I know sidewalks are sort of hit and miss.
right.
And if you don't have a sidewalk or a contiguous sidewalk from a residence or someplace where they would come from, then they're just sort of islands all by themselves. You could drop somebody
Right.
there, they can get across the street fine, but then they can't go anywhere once they get across the street.
Yes, sir. I think the ones that we've identified have been existing sidewalk sections where we may upgrade the handicap ramp. We may install countdown pedestrian signals, audible pedestrian signals, those types of things. So some of the facilities
So
are
they need to
already
use
there.
them
We're just
immediately.
improving them. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
All right.
Alan?
Question, Clark, thanks, Joe. Question regarding the sidewalk connectivity, the first one here, and you said if we were to go from Avonsong to Highway 9 on that side of the road, we would need to pay for that. Why is that?
Avonsong to highway for the streetlights.
It was for the streetlights.
For the
because
streetlights,
it's out of
okay,
distance.
okay. And there's no sidewalk there anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
Well, the funding can only be used within a half mile of the bus routes, and Avonsong's about a half mile from the edge of this
Okay.
bus route.
Okay.
So the shaded area here is our half mile limit.
Gotcha.
Would be the area that we could use those funds within.
And that very well one day could be a developed parcel right there in that corner anyway, which might involve sidewalks and or lights.
So it almost gets to Avonsong, but not really.
Right, okay. Yeah, that would be great. I hope we get it.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is maybe the bus stops or the shelters, kind of put them on the back burner, and as Councilman Thurman said, others, maybe try to spend the money on things that will improve Milton, and also maybe permanent structures that our citizens can use and connect on the sidewalks and things like that.
So I'll add a item for the gateway signage. Did I hear that? Okay.
Is everybody
Signage and
think along that?
streetscape, I would put,
Signage, street check,
it
okay.
gives us a little flexibility.
That'll set us apart a little different.
This may be out of order, yeah? This is not, it's just a revise, just information, if I can.
Yeah, legally, no.
Okay, I'll tell you that first. Just check on bus shelters. Yes.
And feel free to email all of us copies of whatever you want to do.
I
We can
apologize.
touch this after the meeting.
That's fine. I apologize. I don't want to be yelled at.
clerk want to move on to the next item?
Next item is discussion on Crabapple Circle, excuse me, abandonment, presented by Carter Lucas.
And at night.
Spread nice. How'd you have time to make all these copies?
I couldn't put her out on the street, so I put her at the copier. Thank you. Mayor and Council, this is just for informational purposes, just to let you know that we've received a request for the abandonment of the remainder of Crabapple Circle. Down in the Crabapple area, there's a gas station on the northwest corner of Crabapple and 372. There's a small piece of right-of-way that runs between 372 and really that back drive. Back to this back drive. The gas station there on the corner has come to us with a request to abandon that piece of right-of-way. And on the 11 by 17 sheet, I've tried to give you an idea of what exists out there now. When the John Whelan site was built there and they relocated that drive, there's not much left of the old road there. It's an abandoned road bed, very well, or overgrown, not maintained by anyone at this particular point. So it's really not being used any longer. So in the future, what would happen with this type of request, it would come in, it would be advertised, there would be a public notice, and then we would bring forward a resolution to council for your consideration for abandonment of the right-of-way. In this particular case, it's going to be abandoned to 3 property owners, split with the gas station and John Whelan, and then down at the very west end of the existing right-of-way, there's a small piece that will be abandoned to the property owner to the west of the gas station. In this particular case, in talking with Ken, to the best of our knowledge, this property, this right-of-way was acquired through deeds and acquisitions rather than being purchased. So I don't know that there's an opportunity for the city to ask for reimbursement for this particular piece of right-of-way.
Karen?
Now, this was abandoned back on April 3rd, 2006. So what are we abandoning that's different from that?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, it was abandoned up to this point is what the title search has found. So the Crabapple Circle all the way back to where it terminated.
It says it goes from Birmingham Highway according to the ordinance that was passed.
Hmm.
Would you like a copy of it?
I would.
A resolution, excuse me, that was passed. That would be news to the attorney.
Well, that'll make it easy.
That would make it much easier.
It's been abandoned.
What was the date on that resolution?
April 3rd, 2006?
August 3rd?
August 3rd, 2006, right before Milton became a city. One of those things they did down in Crabapple.
And you just happen to know that?
Yeah.
Man, you're good.
She was really involved in all that for 6 months. Bill?
Whether it has been abandoned or not, what happens to that curb cut?
Yeah,
Going to
they-
extend the sidewalk?
Yeah, they are forced to extend the sidewalk and curbing and whatnot.
Who's obligated to
Oh.
remove the curb cut?
If a property were to come in to develop, if a new development or a permit was requested on that property, they would be required to provide those street improvements. Up until that point, any work within the right-of-way would be obviously up to us.
So, I guess what, and I don't know if your question was, Bill, would it be feasible to require the property owner to go ahead and seal that curb cut off? Because right now, you just got an empty curb cut there. Or are you saying, Carter, really the only thing as a city we can do is block that to where if anyone were to ever redevelop that property, they had to get rid of it?
That's right. I don't know that there's anything in our ordinance that would allow us to go to the property owner and remove that curb cut and continue that sidewalk, unless he came in for a building permit or development permit.
Do you agree with that?
I agree with that.
Good question now, because it leaves a little dead end area there. Could be safe. Thank you.
So is this discussion tabled since, given the information?
It might be. And actually, this was just for informational purposes, just to let you know that it was coming. They've done a lot of work that they may not have had to have done.
Because if Fulton County already abandoned it, then there's no need for me to even make any comments about abandonment of it. It's already been done, hopefully.
Why don't we, for the purposes, if we've got this new information, why don't we get that to Ken and let you take it back to whoever needs you to work on it?
Would it surprise you if something was done down at Fulton County and not properly recorded?
No, well, yes, ma'am. Yes, it would. It's very unusual.
I think there's an opportunity to get a refund on legal fees.
I don't know that, Carter, have we spent much on this? I don't think we've done.
No, we haven't done anything on it. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
But they have done a full title search on this property and survey on this property, and this did not show up.
I thought I remembered it when I was looking over the agenda today, and I called Lynn Riley, and she didn't remember it, so, but she told me I had to go in and do a search of all the documents, and that's what I pulled up when I did the search.
Well, that's good, because when we talked to Don
That's the way
Rowland,
to do it. I mean, it should be a duly authorized resolution that should contain a legal description.
It does.
well, yeah,
But I mean, I didn't open the legal description, I can't tell what his
Well,
names are, so.
right, but we ought to be
I
able
can
to
tell that.
ascertain, put this to bed in a few minutes.
When we
In the
don't
hands of
take
the
it,
right.
once you-
It's a ruble. It's a ruble. It's a ruble.
so that's good.
If you want to give that to me, Carter, I will take that off your hands.
I'll make you a copy of it, and I'll take a look at it tomorrow and get a copy over to the attorney.
Okay.
Be the quickest abandonment we've ever done.
City clerk, please count the next item.
Next item is discussion on the revisions to the traffic calming policy. Carter?
Clerk show tonight.
It is that part of
You
that.
just saw Carter's engineer side come out there. He said, I'm not giving that up. I'm until I make a copy of it first.
Is this where we learned the difference between a hump, a bump, and a table?
See.
It all just depends on age.
Anybody want a copy of this? I can share. Would anybody like a copy of this while it's happening? Do you have any more, Carter?
The agenda's online, I know the city meetings are online. I'm sorry, if you could let me know, that's fine. Sure.
Where do we want to put public comment? Can we get a public comment card? And
Sure, you can do that.
At a point, and then maybe, same thing then.
Is it germane to this particular agenda item? If I- You want to go ahead and allow that public comment now, and then we'll follow back up and get a card, and then we'll do the
I'm fine with that.
presentation?
Council allow me to do that.
Let's go
Okay.
for it. Yeah, that's good. Now, but you do have to come to a microphone since we're recording the meeting.
To protect him.
You can fill that out when you throw it, just state your name and address for the record.
Yeah, hi. My name is Brett Cole. I live in Hopewell Plantation. I'm the treasurer of the HOA Association. And I know this past year we had had about, I believe about 80% of our residents signed petitions for speed bumps in our neighborhood. Hopewell Plantation is a severe cut-through from Hopewell Road over through Rhodes Plantation to get over to Bethany. And we have serious problems regarding speeders in our neighborhood. And I know gates aren't an option for us, but speed bumps definitely were an option for us. Again, we had the petition signed by all the residents and turned in at one point. And that's why I'm here. It's just a concern for our neighborhood. The speeding is atrocious. We got a lot of kids that are in our neighborhood, and there's really no way of controlling that right now. And that's why I'm here, just a concern for our neighborhood and how to stop the cut through, well, even help stop the cut through traffic over through Rhodes Plantation back out to Bethany.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. And again, we appreciate the public comment. I would also suggest that maybe our staff contact you later, or vice versa, or if you'd send an email to us, and our staff could take a look at that.
We've been in contact with them, and it will be on this presentation here tonight.
Okay, good deal.
So this is kind of the culmination of a number of discussions that we've had regarding changes to the traffic calming policy. Kind of to give you a little bit brief background on it, the summary or the goals of the program were really speed reduction related, not necessarily volume reduction. The volume reductions may occur as a result of this, but typically what you'll see is the volume will only be reduced when they have somewhere else to go. When there's not another option, typically it will be more of a speed reduction, but not necessarily a volume reduction. And really that's what the ordinance is intended to address. We wanted to clearly define the process and simplify the process that we had for the traffic calming measures, and then create a set of standards for our traffic calming measures, so that we had 3 or 4 that were consistent throughout the city, that we were comfortable in the use, that we understood how they needed to go in, where they needed to go in, and the costs associated with those installations. A quick summary of the process that we've prepared. We would receive an application from a homeowners association or a group of individuals if no homeowners association existed. Public Works would then take a look at it to determine whether or not it was eligible under the criteria that we'll go over in a few minutes. After that, the applicant would then make a determination as to whether or not they wanted to proceed through the process if they were so eligible. With that, there would be a 75%, well, let me back up. There's a 75%, 25% split right now. The revised ordinance would be a 50-50 split between the city and the homeowners association. One of the other questions that we'll have tonight is the implementation of an application fee through this process. If the applicant decided to move forward in the process and paid the application fee, Public Works, based on the 4 details that we provided at one of the previous meetings, would put together a design for the subdivision as well as a preliminary cost estimate that the cost sharing would be based on. At any point in this process, police and fire always have the opportunity from a public safety standpoint to either change the details that we've been using, select another detail that may be more appropriate, or just deny the application in its entirety. Then finally, the applicant would submit their 50% share of the construction costs, and we would go through our standard city procurement policy to do the construction of the traffic calming measures. The eligibility criteria under this program has to be a local residential street, has to have a posted speed limit of 25 to 30 miles an hour, and then we've got a daily traffic requirement of a minimum of 400 vehicles per day and a maximum of 4,000 vehicles per day. So that's really going to cover most of the major subdivisions that we have throughout the city. And then one of the other criteria that I'd like to discuss tonight is there currently is a requirement that your speed limit, your 85th percentile speed limit, is 10 miles an hour or greater over the posted speed limit. So in other words, 85% of the vehicles are have a 10 miles an hour or greater. So it's a significant problem. Street Smarts, who did the original recommendations for the traffic calming policy revisions had recommended that 85th percentile limit be lowered to 3 miles per hour over the posted speed limit. And our staff discussions following that recommendation, that's very difficult. When you get to that level, to be able to demonstrate you've reduced back down to the speed limit is going to be very difficult to do. If you look at the criteria from surrounding communities, most communities do use that 10 miles per hour over the speed limit. Woodstock was one that we found that was a little bit different. They have a criteria that if 30% of the vehicles are going over the speed limit or 10% are 10 miles an hour over the speed limit, that would be the threshold that would trigger their traffic calming policy. And in this case, it was one that we liked, and what we, based on the data that we had, really felt like that was going to get us somewhere in the neighborhood of an 85th percentile, 6 to 7 miles per hour over the posted speed limit. So not quite all the way up to the 10 miles an hour, but still above the 3 miles an hour that was originally recommended. So if you look at how that would break down, we had 11 requests initially for the program. One didn't meet the posted speed limit. I think it was a 35 or 40 mile an hour road. We had 3 that didn't meet the ADT. Most were below the 400 vehicles per day. And then of the remaining 7 requesters, if you broke it down, we went and looked at the 3 mile an hour, 5, 8, and 10 miles an hour to get a breakdown to see where that threshold would put us as far as qualifying communities. And so back on the 3 miles per hour, I'm sorry, we had 7 of those that met the criteria. If you bump that up to 5 miles an hour, we had 6 communities that would meet that, 4 at 8, and then only 1 would qualify at the 10 mile an hour threshold that the program currently is at. If we look at the criteria that the Woodstock had, the 30% over the speed limit and 10% at 10 miles an hour or more, the data that we collected, we didn't collect in that particular type of format, but as we went back through to look at the numbers we had, we're guessing that's going to be somewhere in the 6 to 8 mile an hour. So we're probably going to have 5, and maybe that 6th one that would qualify if we were to use that particular criteria as our threshold. And so of the qualifying communities, White Columns, Crooked Creek, Triple Crown, Hopewell Plantation, Belleterre, Wyndham Farms, and Avonsong, that's where they would fall in that particular criteria depending on the threshold that's selected. So White Columns would be the only one that would qualify at the current rate of 10 miles per hour over. Hopewell Plantation currently is at 9 miles per hour over the speed limit. So they would qualify, I think they would qualify under the Woodstock criteria also. The other thing that most of the programs...
Can I stop you for a second?
Yes, sir.
As we're moving through, does anybody have any questions on the last the chart and the graphs and how we're talking about coming up with the speed and the percentile?
Yeah, I want to make sure I'm understanding your percentiles correctly, Carter.
Okay.
You're saying that the 85 percentile, 85% of the cars that were measured were going above the speed limit at that level, or 15% of the cars were going above the speed limit at that level?
85% of the cars in this...
You may even go
Hopewell
back.
Plantation, their 85 percentile speed was 34 miles an hour.
Okay.
So 85% of the vehicles were traveling
All right.
34 or less. So you have 15% of the vehicles that are traveling even greater than that. It's a standard measure in the traffic world and a good threshold so that you get the majority, but you take out the extremes.
Right. Understood.
Okay, so let's just use Hopewell Plantation for an example. If we held it at 10 miles an hour, then they would not qualify.
Yes, sir, that's correct. The only one that would be White Columns. Now, some of these subdivisions have multiple locations that they've requested. I think our thought would be that we'll review the subdivision as a whole when they come in, and certain sections may qualify, certain sections may not. But we'll work through a plan with the homeowners association that might address both locations, but we may not specifically add traffic calming measures in those sections that don't qualify under the program.
I guess an added piece of information, in your second column, difference from speed limit, each one of these different roads here posted differently, or some at 25 and some at 30?
No, so I think they're all 25.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, I think they were all posted 25.
Okay, sorry, Carter, I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
Move on.
All right.
Big point.
So the application fee, not something that was typical in the programs that we saw in other communities, but with a threshold at 10 miles an hour, maybe the numbers of applications aren't what they would be. What we would be recommending is an application fee of $500 that we would use to cover the internal cost of working through with the homeowners association, development of the plan, development of the cost estimate, administration of the cost estimate, or administration of the construction. But there's also a consideration that that fee could be rolled into the construction cost. And so if the homeowners association moves all the way through to construction, that $500 could be credited into their share of the construction cost. But it would allow us to recoup some of the cost building up to that point, so that at the end, we haven't gone through a whole exercise of taking up staff time to develop a plan and a cost estimate, and then the subdivision not be able to follow through on their end to move it through to construction.
I think that's also, it's probably wouldn't really come anywhere close to covering our actual cost, when you figure the time and the department head, the staff and whatnot, but it also makes sure that subdivision's serious enough, and before we go out and start calculating.
Yes, sir.
What's the council's opinion, any discussions you've had, or with homeowners, and Alan, you may be, how do you think that will go with homeowners associations, whatnot, if they had to?
Well, I think as long as, and thank you for asking, I think as long as we were able to justify the amount, I know that some other fee issues have come up before, i.e. the alarm fees, where we've been asked to justify why it was that we charged as much as we have for certain fees. And as long as we can justify the need for that fee based on hours that we expend and everything else, I think it would separate people from just inquiring from those who are really serious about wanting to do something about it.
Right.
Now, if they did not qualify, I assume this is a non-refundable fee, correct?
They would know whether or not they qualified before we made them pay the fee. So we'll go ahead and get them into the process. We'll evaluate it. If they do qualify and can move forward, that's the time that they would pay the fee. Yes, ma'am.
Without asking for any public comment, but let's say someone was a treasurer of Hopewell Plantation subdivision, would a fee like that be a roadblock, or you could just shake your head or not?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I just say one thing, I don't know if Carter's getting into this, but I don't know, are you going to discuss whether they're permanents, temporaries, or I know the road plantation, besides the speed bumps, they also have the medians where people kind of have to drive around them. There's different options out there in terms of speed bumps.
We will.
Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah.
Bill?
Maybe speaking to that point, and a couple of the others here, there are different methods of traffic calm, evidenced by your pictorials back here, I guess. Just in the interest of not wasting a lot of staff time when you get an application in, even though the applicant has put down $500, it certainly wouldn't cover probably the cost of design for everything in Hopewell much judge that, well, they're gonna need 10 speed tables up through there. And give them some idea up front before you really get into the whole design process.
Well, and the term design may be a little bit misleading from our standpoint, the engineering standpoint. Really, it's going to be relatively simple design. What we've tried to do, and I think at one of the previous meetings, and I'm sorry, Mr. Longoria, I should have brought a copy for you, we provided the 4 details that have been developed for the program. In those details, it really lays out the criteria of where and when those specific things can be used. And so we can fairly simply go through and say, you know, this section of road qualifies for either this one measure or these 3 measures, and I don't see any reason why we can't work with a homeowners association to see which one they would prefer in that particular location. And with that, those details are also estimated construction costs. And so you can really step down through, we're going to do 4 speed bumps in this particular section. Those have a cost anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000, depending on the materials that are used. So I don't think it'll be a problem at all in that application process before they really get into it to let them know where they stand.
If a homeowners association didn't qualify, let's say they had some concerns about speed, we did the research, they didn't necessarily qualify, but the homeowners association was adamant on doing something like this anyway. Is there an option here for the homeowners association to pick up 100% of the cost and go ahead and put the devices in place?
Well, there could be. There could be. I think
the treasurer of a homeowners association nearby that
Yeah.
takes traffic to a whole nother level in terms of their discussion. I think that would be an option they would want to see available.
Speaking of that, 'cause I know maybe also legally and Carter were precious because, I guess they'd have to have design guidelines and whatnot in order to, even if they want to pay for it 100%, not people just start putting up speed bumps.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's
I'm thinking it'd be something that they would have to subcontract through the city. In other words, the homeowners association wouldn't just go put them in themselves. It'd be something the city would have to put in. Therefore, it'd have to meet all the city criteria. It's just that the homeowners association would have to pay for it.
the city of Milton can always accept funding from private entities if they want to pay for that and otherwise meets engineering guidelines and can be permitted. Sure, that's no problem at all.
I think what we tried to address in the ordinance was that if the subdivision qualified, but there was not funding available on the city side, that they could move forward through the program if they funded it at 100%. They would still be required to follow the entire program as if the city were funding their portion of it. I'll need to think about that a little bit if it doesn't qualify, whether or not we would want them to.
Where if it doesn't meet our standards or doesn't qualify, that all the money in the world doesn't allow somebody to go in and
That was just kind of where I was coming
The
from.
put
meaning of
speed
the
bumps in.
ordinance.
I think it's got to qualify based on the standards that the council adopts that we recommend.
And
Otherwise, you'd have somebody that would say, I want a speed bump in front of my house, and as long as I got a $3,000 check to write, they could get a speed bump. We wouldn't want that.
well, it would.
It's got to be an HOA issue, and it's subject to the voting of the HOA or the group of homes that's included as part of that, because I think somewhere you said you had to have a 75%.
That's right.
Vote to warrant that, and so I mean, there's plenty of other obstacles to getting that done. My concern is that some people take 8 miles an hour over the speed limit as serious business, and they don't see the difference between that and 9 miles an hour. So,
Well, I'll say that some of the other programs have a different phase in this too, where a phase 1 will be to take a speed trailer out to the site, and so that you're posting for everybody to see what your speed is at that particular moment. We did not put that in here. What we've been able to tell is that can be effective while the speed trailer is out there, but as soon as it leaves, that effect diminishes. The other thing I think would be, once they're installed, they become the city's to maintain. I'm not sure that under the LARP program, where the state is paying for repaving, that they will repave a road with traffic calming measures on it. So, that takes it out of that program. Not that that's a big program, but it is out there.
Yeah.
So I think we could probably consider that and think about how we would handle a situation like that, and maybe that's a case-by-case basis. And we can look at it to see if there may be some other alternatives to address those subdivisions that don't quite meet the threshold.
Alan?
Thank you, Mayor. In addition to the funding aspect of it and maintenance, provide there would be a neighborhood that would, pick up 100% of the tab, and then the maintenance part of that comes with it would have to come back to the city. Not only that, but I wonder what the liability issues would be, assuming there's property damage or something that would be associated with the installation of those devices, given that the neighborhood paid for them and the city did not. Who would be responsible for the damage, or who would be potentially liable?
It's a good question. And who pays for them is not going to be dispositive about who is ultimately responsible from a liability perspective, because that would be ultimately a city project on city roads, utilizing city right of way. So whatever the liability question is, it's not going to be off our back. It won't go to the private entity just because they forked over the money. It would still be, the analysis would still be just like it was a generic city road.
Just somebody else paying for it?
Correct.
Okay.
That's right.
Well, and I'll say that just as we're having this discussion tonight about what that threshold should be, I don't see why there would be any reason why we can't, if a neighborhood wanted to fund it 100%, why that would we would incur any more liability. They would have to do it under the same exact criteria that every other subdivision would. And in fact, the speed humps out on Wood Road were funded, as I understand it, 100% by the citizens out there.
Well, if we're not, I can understand why we wouldn't want to reduce the threshold to 3, all the way down to 3 for many different reasons. One being we don't have the money to fund all these different neighborhoods, to have all these 50-50 split with all these. But I would offer that, some of the neighborhoods that are probably like the second tier here, that maybe, not white columns that qualifies for the top, but maybe
Right.
the second tier there, if possibly we could have something in our ordinance that would allow them the opportunity to go 100%, if they're able to do that. And then we might be able to have money to pick up the maintenance, where we wouldn't have money to pick up the installation of all the neighborhoods on the list.
Or maybe
Okay.
10's not the number.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at it, and I know you've got more in your presentation.
Oh, that's
I don't know if you want to hit it now or not, but I mean, you kind of look at it, and 3's at one extreme, and 10 seems to be but one away from the
That's right.
opposite extreme. So I guess that's part of our discussion this evening to,
Yes, sir.
to determine if 10 is the number, or if it's 5 or 8 or 6 or 7 or what.
Yes, sir.
Well, the test is still subject to priority budget and scheduling, right?
That's right.
So just because they pass all the criteria doesn't mean the trucks show up tomorrow and start putting in the device.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay.
Unless they wanted to fund it 100%, then we would work them right through the process.
Right to the
Go
front of the
ahead,
line.
No, but I think that's, that may be that's a good point Alan brought up. That, maybe someone further down the scale where, they have the opportunity to fund it 100%, although, like you say, further on down the scale, you don't want to, it shouldn't be something that every neighborhood could, if there's not really a problem there, be able to have speed bumps. Go ahead.
Mr. Mayor, just one quick thing too, with any road construction project, funding of 100% is always a little bit of a tricky thing, because you've been involved in road projects, depending upon if there's cost overruns, or there are change orders, or there are contract disputes, 100% can become quite expensive, which is a lot of times why you see a lot of bonds issued on these construction projects to ameliorate against that risk. So my only point would be, is to the extent we begin accepting money, if we want to do that 100%, we'll have to be careful about what we set the 100% mark at, because
That's right.
like any developer trying to put in roads in a subdivision, they typically have to bond and provide a performance bond to make sure that what they start, they finish with their money.
And we have the same issue with the 50-50 split. How we address cost overruns, how we address all the issues that Ken just talked about that you deal with on the contract side. So that is definitely something that we'll have to work through in either case.
Does it cost more to pave a road? I mean, other than the LARP issue, does it cost more to pave a road that has these devices installed?
Well, you have a start and a stop, and so you've got, and depending on what the device is, when we talk about some that are vertical, which would be like the speed hump, versus horizontal, which would be the chicanes and the narrowing, dealing with the pavement right adjacent to those traffic calming measures becomes an issue. Doing it correctly at those measures becomes an issue. Having to stop and pull out and move your equipment over or through those becomes an issue.
The reason I ask is because that could be an issue too, because some of these neighborhoods here, of course, they don't have brand new roads. And if they were to come up with the money to be able to install these devices and they put it on an old road, and it's going to end up costing us a whole lot more when we have to pave it, that's a consideration that we need to be looking at too.
Some of them are removable. And I think I might have some pictures in here when we look at some of the examples that we can discuss. Well, I guess we had finished talking about the application fee. And so I guess what I just said was of the two types, we have horizontal and vertical type deflections. And so the vertical ones are anything that you have to go over, speed humps, bumps, cushions, and then horizontal measures where you narrow the road or you require traffic to move around a particular obstacle in order to control their speed. And so also what we talked a little bit about earlier, the standard details that we had developed for this were really to give us location considerations, some standard dimensions, some standard materials, types of traffic control that would be associated with them. Generally, with any of these types of things, you've got to have warnings beforehand, and then estimated base cost that we can work through on the construction cost estimates. We did take these to DRB. DRB reviewed the details that we had put together, had some various comments on materials and markings that we took into consideration. They really wanted to try and use really a base material that wouldn't expend a lot of city dollars. So there is a provision in the ordinance that if the subdivision or homeowners association wanted to upgrade the materials on any of these types of measures, maybe rather than the rubber speed hump, they wanted brick. That option's available, but it's 100% any of the additional cost to them. So the 50% that the city would pay would be based on the base cost on the details that were established. And anything above that would be subject to the homeowners association. They liked the landscaping and some of the measures, the horizontal deflection measures where we had center islands or chicanes that were subject to landscaping. They preferred those to rather just a concrete top. The landscaping, any of those, again, would be subject to the homeowners association maintenance in its entirety. I would envision that we would have an indemnification and a maintenance agreement for those types of measures with the homeowners association so that we weren't drawn back into that in the future to maintain those. And then to try and give you an idea about some of the things that were presented to DRB, this is a little bit difficult to see, but these were some measures. These are actually down in Sandy Springs. Rather than the standard speed hump, here's one that's stamped in brick, gives it kind of a stone look, really nice looking. And here are some of the rubber prefab speed humps. They're just bolted down. They can be removed for paving operations. traffic calming's not necessarily an exact science. You can get these things in a location and find out in actual operation that maybe that's not the best place to do it. So there's some advantage to the temporary ones that they could be put down. If the plan needed to be modified, it could be modified. One of the things that we had talked about was purchasing a number of these temporary measures that could be used in a subdivision, and if they worked in that particular location, it could become more permanent, and then we could move those temporary ones to other subdivisions. Each location on the temporary one probably runs you around $2,000 to $3,000. Takes about, well, the manufacturer claims it takes about an hour to install each location. I think from what we can tell from other jurisdictions who have used the temporary ones, it takes about a day. But I guess all of that will improve with experience. I think the biggest concern with some of the temporary measures is just the aesthetics of them. You know, they're typically black rubber and with the yellow or white markings on them, so they're not the best looking measures. The speed tables and crosswalks was another one of our standard details. Again, a variety of materials. We would have a base material. That's just an asphalt type material. And the speed cushions, I guess the difference with the speed cushions from the others is they're usually maybe 6 to 7 feet wide, and you'll have 2 or 3 across so that emergency vehicles can span those and work their way through, but normal vehicles will hit one or the other. So you don't really have the delay. I think the fire and police department prefer those types of measures. And then the horizontal deflections would be the chicanes and center islands where you require a vehicle to maneuver their way through these types of traffic calming measures. To me, the chicanes and the center islands, the narrowing, are not quite as effective when you don't have a higher volume road because you've got a clear path through those. Unless you can really get some deflection, my guess is that it has a relatively minimal impact on speed reduction on a subdivision road like these. Again, these, the one in the lower left-hand corner, well, actually all of them except for the one on the upper left-hand corner, I think, are down in the same neighborhood in Sandy Springs. The one in the upper right-hand corner might be that section of Hopewell Plantation that's in Alpharetta, actually. Yeah, so that's the those are the standards that we've prepared to go by. So I guess the discussion tonight, we were trying to get some feedback on the threshold, the eligibility criteria on the speed limit, and whether or not we wanted to move forward with the application fee on this. And our next step would be then to incorporate any comments we had tonight and then bring the revised ordinance back to council for adoption at a later meeting.
I'd kind of throw out first, I believe probably the application fee would not be a huge hurdle for the subdivisions, and it certainly could be justified. And get council's feedback on that, and also with maybe on the criteria, you know, maybe hit it somewhere in the middle or on the.
So that Woodstock criteria, which is what we thought would get it right in that particular area, would probably be the best way to go.
That's my opinion on those two. I'd like to hear what council has to say about this.
Yeah, in terms of the application fee, I mean, we're talking about $500 is the application fee only if we've determined that the application meets the criteria.
Yes, sir.
So
We would
it's,
take the money.
you're moving forward at that point regardless. So if the application fee is meant to offset any costs associated with, I wouldn't call it frivolous applications, it's really not doing the job at that point, because somebody can ask for approval prior to that. So if we were to knock down the application fee and make it a barrier to, you know, some subdivision coming in and just, you know, saying, hey, I've got 22 locations, they all need some kind of device, or do it in mass. I mean, does it make sense to move that thing forward and actually make it a fee that's based on the application, or leaving it where it is, and then it really becomes just for sort of part of the cost of construction, I guess is.
Well, where it falls in the process is we would only determine whether or not the subdivision was eligible to move forward. And so that would involve really, we know what the speed limit is. I mean, that part of it's easy. The traffic count is the one. It would involve us going out and doing a traffic count at that location. I'm okay with that. I mean, we like to have traffic data. So there would be no conceptual plan developed at that point. Well, all we would be doing is saying, you met the speed limit, you met the traffic count, you met the, whatever our criteria may be, 10%, or 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, you met that speed criteria. So you're eligible to move forward. Before we expend any more time and effort in the development of the conceptual plan, that's when the application and the fee would be due. Okay. So I don't want to discourage people from coming in when they perceive that they have a problem in their neighborhood, and we'll evaluate it. But before we go through the development of the plan, I would like to make sure they're serious.
Any other comments on the?
Going back to the, we gave them a ballpark estimate, I think that might, at the application time, be enough for them to take back to their board or whoever's going to fund it, see if it's actually feasible for them to fund it.
I think what the way it's currently set up is we would get to step 3, which would be to determine those criteria. Then we would take the fee. Then we would develop a cost estimate. But at the time they apply, we can certainly provide them with the details, and that has an estimated construction cost on it. That, you know, we may be able to say if you have 1,500 feet of road and these measures are every 500 feet, you know, you're going to be looking at 3 to 5 of these measures. And maybe we could even say these qualify and these don't, you know, and they have the cost estimate. This measure is $2,000, this measure is $5,000. And they could go back and then determine whether or not, that would get them in the ballpark. And still, it would not be a huge staff effort at that point to be able to provide that information to them.
I believe that the 10 miles per hour is too high, definitely needs to be lowered.
Okay.
Especially if we're going to go 50-50 now. We might as well go ahead and take care of problems in as many of these neighborhoods as we can. So, I mean, to me, if you made it like at 5 or 6 miles per hour, or went with the Woodstock method, then that would hopefully take care of some of the speeding in some of these neighborhoods. And
Okay.
I also wanted to know, it looks like to me that the island, we used to have an island on Birmingham Road, if you're heading from Birmingham Park to the intersection there, that we removed, and I know it was originally put in as a traffic calming type feature. Why did we decide that didn't work?
We had a lot of people running off.
And it was a higher speed limit too.
We had a lot of people
45
hitting it.
probably.
Yeah, it was, and those goes back to the days of Abby Jones being here, if you all remember Abby. She gave me some very technical engineering reason as to why that was the improper feature at that location. And it had to do with the fact that it should have been, I'm going to get it all wrong, so I'm not even going to try to tell you what she told me. But long story short, I remember her telling me that was the wrong feature for where it was, which was evidenced by the fact that people kept continuing to hit it.
All of a sudden, there was a tree in the middle of the road. I think it's probably the non-engineering term for it.
And the other question I have is, we only have it for 25 and 30 mile per hour
Fire truck.
of road. Are there any that are 35 mile per hour that we ought to consider?
Well, once you get outside of the typical subdivision where those are going to be the normal posted speed limit, then you, I think, start to get into a question of liability on the city's part and putting in, it really is an obstruction in the roadway.
Right.
And if somebody were to be injured on that, and you're outside of what would be considered the normal criteria for a traffic calming program, Ken may
I know
be
in
able
South
to
Florida,
trump
they
this,
have
but
them on, I mean, everywhere you go. Of course, they don't have the subdivisions, they have more of a grid type network, but they have them
Right.
everywhere.
right.
And some of those roads are more than a 30 mile per hour road. They use different ones. They'll use tables, obviously, they don't use a speed bump in the middle of it.
Right.
They have some kind of traffic calming for somebody going 45
I would guess you'd really get in some trouble with the roads around. I'll use my road, for example. My road's 35 miles an hour, but people speed down a lot. I'm sure myself and my neighbors would love to put some speed calming devices on our road, but it's not a neighborhood. It's not, like you say, there'd probably be the liability from people going too fast and hitting them. I think we'd probably open up a can of worms, wouldn't we, if we went over the 30 mile an hour?
I think what you have to rely on, and I hate to defer to this, but I think you have to rely on generally accepted engineering principles that will dictate what you can put in a roadway and whether it's safe or not. And so long as you're complying with those, I think we'd be okay. And if we get outside of those, and again, I don't know if there may be some reigning engineering in Florida that's different than what we have here, but I mean, we're gonna have to look to Carter to tell us, what in the industry in Georgia is accepted.
And I would like to look to see if there are any traffic calming for roads that are 35, because we have a lot of 35-mile-per-hour roads that people are going 35 miles per hour on. And, I know there's some traffic calming that would not be acceptable, could be considered dangerous, but it seems like there's gotta be something that would be acceptable, and, with proper signage, you could get people to slow down on some of these roads.
I don't think that the application fee is a big issue, as discussed amongst us and heard from some folks that are here. I think most of the stuff that you can throw out there to begin with before that is like you said, easily answered. You can, most of these things are fairly simple, so you can almost have unit costs. Some would be, like you say, $1,500 or whatever a piece. I'd like to propose us maybe looking at the going about 7 miles over the 85th percentile. That kind of, just looking at your chart, you see a lot of them hitting at 5 and about half of them hitting at 8. So maybe 7 is the magic number for us to think about.
We'll do a little bit more on that Woodstock criteria. That's where we think that's going to fall. And before we bring this forward again, we'll try and get a better answer on where exactly that ends up with the data that we have.
Joe?
Yeah, Carter, on the 75% approval by the group, and I'll call it the group because it could be a homeowners association or whatever. How do we actually define that? Because you look at a place like White Columns that's got, I don't know what, 12 miles of road within the subdivision. A lot of that mileage is far from where you would actually need traffic calming devices. Crooked Creek, similar deal. It's just Creek Club that most people worry about. So, and the reason I bring this up is, you get a substantial number of homeowners. They can't agree much on anything, much less 75% being in alignment on something like a speed bump. The people that live on the affected road obviously have the biggest stake in the issue, and the people that don't live anywhere near it sometimes don't care. So how do you balance this 75 percentile number with keeping the interests of the homeowners?
Well, that's a good question.
That's a great question, because I'd say most neighborhoods out there, you're thinking everybody affected, but it's usually just the main drag through there and all the little outlet or the little dead end.
But they are affected because they'd have to pay for it.
No. What I'm saying, it would be hard to get, the people that are really affected are on the main road. The people off in the cul-de-sacs and whatnot aren't affected and probably don't want to pay for it, don't want to do anything. So I think Joe's point is,
you can probably get to 50% of the homes in Crooked Creek within, less than a quarter mile of actually ingress into the subdivision itself.
Right.
And that's not where you're going to be putting speed bumps. You're putting speed bumps in the center. And people say, I'm not spending money on speed bumps. This has already happened to us, just so you know.
Well, it's a good question, and we've had a lot of discussion on that. And the way it's written in the ordinance is that 75% of the people within the study area, within the affected study area, have to agree. And so what we would have to do is look at the subdivision as a whole and determine those properties that are affected by these traffic calming measures.
Okay.
If you've got a way out the back, then you may be outside of the study area. If the subdivision only has one entrance and everybody has to come in and out of that entrance, then everybody in the subdivision is affected by those
Okay.
traffic calming measures. So it'll be different for each subdivision, and where we draw that line is really going to be on a case-by-case basis. We'll work with the homeowners association on it, but at some point, we will make the determination in Public Works that a home is either in or out of the affected study area.
Okay, I just wanted to know if you were just saying, no, the whole homeowners association's included. All right.
Only if there's only one way in or out, or the extent of the traffic calming measures would cover all entrances and exits to that subdivision.
Okay.
But there certainly could be a situation where a portion of the subdivision would be excluded from the study area.
Could you and your department use common sense on that as far as, you know, I know you could.
Asking a
We
lot
allow
there.
leeway to where, because, you know, every
If I don't have to commit to that tonight.
neighborhood's gonna be, you know, different, so I don't know how we, you know, allow you to, you know, use your engineering practices and judgment.
The best I can say is that we'll work with the homeowners associations when they come in. But the way it's written, we'll make the determination on who those affected property owners would be.
Because you may only have 20% of the residents or people, you know, homes in the neighborhood on the main road, and 80% off where it doesn't matter, but the 20% are really having a, you know, it's a big issue for them and a lot of speeding, so.
But if those 20% that are the 80% have to use that road, then they would be included in the affected area and part of it. Now, once we make that determination, we're kind of out of the picture with the homeowners association. They're going to need to go back and either convince the whole homeowners association that they need to pay for this, or how they work out their funding will be up to them. But we'll make that determination on the study area and give it back to them, both for approval on the 75% approval and how they're going to work out the funding with the homeowners that may not be affected by it.
Yeah, I'm kind of looking to you two guys because you probably, you know, have more experience with that. Just, you know, I could just see where that would be, you know, on a neighborhood that had, and I'm going to define the affected area, not because someone lives in a cul-de-sac and it's real quiet on their street and they don't have any speeders, but then they have to drive out and go over a couple of humps. I think you're talking, those are affected people.
Yes, sir.
I'm thinking more of the affected people, the ones that are living on the road that people are speeding on. So I'm wondering if there's some way to value that more, because you may have a neighborhood that 80% of the people are on the main drag, and so 80% of the people are affected. Or you may have where 20% are and 80% aren't really affected, but by your definition they are. That's going to be a much different animal. So I'm just wondering if there's some kind of sliding scale or.
Well, there are ordinances out there that address that to the extent that we would require 75% of the affected study area to agree, and 100% of the property owners in which these are directly in front of their homes to agree. So for that stretch of road where we've got traffic calming measures, everyone along that section would have to agree, and 75% elsewhere.
Might as well say 105%.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that ain't gonna happen.
Well, again, I think that's gonna tighten it up even more. I'm just looking at it, and like I say, there's gonna be different neighborhoods, it's gonna be a totally different animal that aren't gonna fit these, you know.
See, I would almost be willing to say the affected homeowners would be those people who live along the stretch where the devices would be installed. Where I have a little apprehension is probably in the funding aspect of it, and the fact that every homeowner pays dues, and every homeowner is going to have to pay for the installation of these. And I think the overriding document that will be controlling in that regard would be the covenants, because the covenants then would dictate, you know, in cases of special assessments, if that were needed, you know, would there need to be a 2/3 vote of the voting members to pay for that? Is there a limitation on the amount of dues increase that a board can increase the dues without having to go to the membership? They also have a democratic process in place for taking care of board members that raise dues too much. So I'm kind of sold on the fact that the affected homeowners would be the ones living along the route where the devices would be installed.
Or they'd have to travel over them.
Yeah.
Well, but they're all, I mean, everybody has to travel over them, but,
All goes back to fact that we don't care how the group funds this. If the entire 75% say if Crooked Creek doesn't want them, but the people living on Creek Club Drive, if they wanted to personally fund them, wouldn't that be acceptable?
Yeah, because I think we're saying you gotta have 75% of the neighborhood just approving it.
I'm like you though. I mean, we say you're approved, you meet the qualifications, now you got to pay 50%. It's your responsibility. However they come out with that 50% is their problem.
I agree, yeah, I see where
That's
it's
right.
coming there, but I'm talking about on the approval, just the approval from the neighborhood to allow them.
Was that true? Is that what I'm hearing?
You gotta have 75%
You gotta have-
for approval in the neighborhood for allowance.
Of the study area, of the affected area.
Right. And that's
Right,
not,
so it may not be all of the subdivision.
Does it, 75% what all the other cities do, or are there some of them that say you only have to require a majority or supermajority at 67%?
I think, I don't know that I can answer that specifically, but I think the ones that we've looked at, that's been fairly common. I think the study area, it may be the part that each community will debate on how they want to define that study area.
if you left it there, I would think you would either have to weigh the it depends on what you call, what you define the affected
Mm-hmm.
area or the affected homeowners as. To me, that is the people that are living on the road where people are speeding too much. You know, those are the affected people, in my opinion. So I would think you'd either have to try to tie the study area into the affected area more, or have it as a sliding scale where the main thoroughfare gets more percentage weighted, credit versus people in the back that really don't care.
We've
But I
got an
think-
idea to throw out down
Hey,
here, but
Ken,
Ken's more
Chris,
eloquent than I am, so I'll let him.
I'm absolutely not more eloquent, but I do want to say this one thing, and that is I know what y'all are grappling with, and obviously what Carter's grappling with, and I just want to stress that in the context of traffic calming, we have a tremendously more amount of flexibility in how we define who has to opt in. I mean, we're not talking about abandonment. We're not revisiting that issue. This is gonna remain a city.
Can we please?
Yeah, I understand.
Next week.
This is going to remain a city road, and so we can configure this however it makes sense to configure it. If we want to make it simply those that are directly contiguous to the stretch of roadway that is going to be impacted, you all have that discretion. I mean, at the end of the day, these are city roads that your public works department and director needs to make the call on whether traffic calming makes sense. The opt-in is another matter entirely. I know that in the Crooked Creek situation previously, we talked about, what percentage of the HOA needs to speak before it's the voice of the HOA. Well, y'all can set that at whatever y'all can defer to the bylaws, as Councilmember Tarr mentioned. Y'all can pretty much the sky's the limit on how you all want to dictate this and draft this ordinance. So I just want to let you know, a lot more flexibility than what we talked about
Because
earlier this year.
in theory, if the city wanted to solve a problem and the neighborhood didn't, we would, by gosh, go out there and put them in there and pay for them, and you like it or don't.
That's exactly right.
That's right.
That's exactly right.
I think
So
part
one of the
this-
options that when I leaned over and talked to Ken, maybe this is one of those cases where in some of these larger neighborhoods where getting 75% of people to agree on anything is impossible.
Right.
Maybe this is one of those situations where instead of taking that person-to-person vote, you do allow the HOA board to speak on behalf of its neighborhood. So long as it's a, incorporated entity that has the ability to speak on behalf of its neighborhood. I don't know, that's just an idea to throw out there that, other than polling individual
Well, it's not that they can
houses.
speak on behalf of the neighborhood, but their guidelines on what percentage have to vote in the affirmative in order to speak on their behalf is completely up to the HOA, as opposed to us setting some limit. So,
Yeah, I just see this, this thing could be a different animal depending on different subdivisions. You have one that 80% of the folks are affected, of course, you're gonna, it'd be easy to get 75% fine. You got one neighborhood that maybe only 20% of the people are affected because it's a large neighborhood and a lot of artery or, in cul-de-sacs, and there's no way it could ever, and it may be just as dangerous or whatever, but there's no way based on the 75% that they'd get that passed. So maybe you're right.
Are you better with, I mean, is that something that the council would consider, that depending on the HOA's own bylaws, covenants, and all that good stuff, so long as they did what was required in their neighborhood to speak on behalf of the neighborhood, that the HOA could serve as that 75%?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about our discussion about how we got to that. What we wanted to ensure is, because we were using tax dollars on our portion of that to install, that everybody who was affected or had to travel over these had an opportunity to voice their opinion. And we didn't want to be in a situation where a homeowner association was speaking out for property owners who were going to be affected when we were spending tax dollars. And so we were trying to get the area as large as possible so that everybody could have a voice in whether or not they wanted that money spent.
Maybe this is something that you guys could firm up a little, rethink it and come up with some other ideas and bring back to us.
We can certainly do that.
Alan, you got
Yeah, I think we're gonna go on down the line. I see Chris over here making notes on our position. He's left yours blank, so maybe he'll fill in yours in, Joe. But as far as where I stand on some of these issues, I'm okay with the 50-50 split, provided we have funding available. In terms of the percentage and qualification eligibility criteria, I would be willing to go down to 8 miles per hour. With the greater the 85th speed, the higher the priority in terms of funding. Could look at the Woodstock criteria. Perhaps it's probably around the same thing. I'm okay with the $500 recommended fee, provided that staff gives a ballpark figure. Because some of the HOAs might not even know what kind of money you're talking about. $20,000, $5,000, they don't have any idea. So provide some preliminary numbers to them right off the bat. Also, if there's a way to explain to them, or at least make it very clear to them that, okay, once the study's done and you are approved, we are going to determine which devices are appropriate for your neighborhood. That may or may not be speed humps. It may be something that you may not want, but you need to know that any excess of what we approve is going to have to be taken over by the subdivision 100%. That could add some clarity to the application process, I believe, because some people are coming into this thinking, oh, well, we want nice, beautiful islands that stick out in the street and all that. Well, we may not fund that. The other thing is in terms of affected property owners, I think that what we've discussed here needs to be that affected homeowners would be those people who live contiguously with where the devices are going to be installed. If they are approved and eligible, then I believe that it should be left up to the HOA on how they provide that money. Whether it be the affected homeowners have to come up with that 50%, whether it be the HOA foots the bill out of their reserve, whatever that may be, we just tell them that they're approved and then they have to come up with the money.
Yes, sir.
That's it.
I tend to agree with all those points. With the only question I have, and Carter, you brought up, is because I was on board with the affected homeowners, but like Carter said, it is tax dollars being spent and it's homeowners association dollars being spent. So obviously the majority of the residents are affected cost-wise. So again, the only thing I would throw into that is to let you guys maybe rethink that and come back with some other, thoughts next time we talk about this. That
Okay.
do a little more research on that.
And I guess to your point, I guess I'm comfortable with it from the perspective of, every neighborhood, I shouldn't say every neighborhood, but almost every neighborhood has covenants that address those issues. And if you've got a board that's, about to spend $30,000 of something that's not very popular with the majority of the people that live in the neighborhood, they'll recall the board. And that'll just end that right then and there. So, and that's with anything in the neighborhood. So I guess I'm just comfortable with saying, okay, leave it up to the HOA to figure out how they're going to pay for it, and things will take care of itself. Maybe I'm being naive in that regard. But.
Joe, you got anything to add?
Well, I would favor allowing the HOA's covenants to manage that, and the reason I say that is because for a lot of issues, a majority of the homeowners don't get out to vote on the issue itself. I would love to report that, every annual meeting of the homeowners association, we have 100% of the homeowners show up, but that's just not the way it is. We're lucky if we get 35% of the homeowners to show up. And so there are covenants that cover how we make decisions in the vacuum of participation. And I think in order to make some of this stuff happen, if it's a big enough issue, homeowners will show up and vote. If there's not a big enough issue, the ones that show up will vote. But either way, the homeowners association has some control over managing it and moving it forward the way they need to. So,
Bert, you want to go?
I've already spoken.
Bill? Okay.
I'd go along with Woodstock formula.
Okay, anything to add? All right, you guys. think you're
Good, thank you, that's productive.
Thank you.
Our city clerk, please sound the next item, and thank you, Carter, for
Hard to get the phone to sleep.
the
Thank you.
The last item is discussion on the alcohol beverage code, respect distance requirements and schools, presented by our city manager, Chris Hockenberg.
And quickly deferred to our city attorney, Ken Gerard.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, this is a resolution I have put in front of you is a proposed resolution. It was something that was forecast a few weeks ago when we had an alcohol license application come in front of you involving sip wines. And I'll be very candid with you, it was discussed. I don't know whether the council has an interest in moving forward on this, but since it was discussed and presented as an option, then I thought I would put something together and bring it to you. I think I also sent you a fairly lengthy email walking through some of my analysis on this. The issue that was presented, at least that served as the catalyst for this resolution, was how we measure distances with respect to sip wines, and the notion that we believe the grounds, the school grounds, were closer than their surveyor did, and upon hearing the discussion and arguments with their surveyor, we decided that in the absence of any language in our code that made it absolutely clear, we would yield to their surveyor in this situation. But then the notion came up, well, maybe we should modify our code to seal up this loophole. Now, whether or not it's a loophole is something this council can decide. I'm not sure that it is a loophole, but the issue had to do with whether or not you can leave the impervious portions of either a sidewalk or a road or a highway, as is called out both in the Milton Code and in the state law, and go into the right-of-way to then bridge the gap to get to the nearest school grounds. Because what our code says is you go from the alcohol establishment and then the nearest direct line on the ground following what appears to be the impervious surfaces. And how we were doing our calculation was then walking off our impervious surface and getting on the right-of-way, which can be, as we know, ditches and grass and dirt and gravel, and then hopping onto the school grounds that way. And their surveyor legitimately said, that's not the way you do it. You need to take the impervious surface to the front entrance. And the notion was brought up, well, perhaps we need to add right-of-way to the Milton Code as a means of closing that loophole. And as I mentioned in my email, that would make our code less forgiving. And I don't know whether the council wants to do that, and I also don't know whether you want to deviate from state law, because state law and the Milton Code are perfectly consistent right now. They jibe. If we add right-of-way, it will be different. So I bring this to you because I felt like that was my instruction. I felt like that was the general head nod I got from the council. But whether or not you want to take and add right-of-way to this distance measurement calculation is up to the council. I felt like I needed to bring it to you.
Let me ask a question. As our code is now,
Yes.
you're saying is in sync with state code.
Yes.
What, if the situation with this last application came up,
Yes.
in the future, would that be handled the same way as we handled this last one?
I think it would need to be, Mr. Mayor, because at this point we have a little bit of precedent now that we are going to calculate these measurements based on the impervious surfaces.
And you're saying that's the way the state does it?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's the way.
Because I'd be the first to say, I wouldn't really want to deviate from the state code if that's, what the state and everybody else does and whatnot. I know we can tighten it up or whatever, but.
We can,
That's my
and
opinion.
again, yeah, we can make the code more restrictive. We can't make it more lax. This will be making it more restrictive because this is obviously making our distances less forgiving. So,
And the only reason I say that, you know, I think Milton's different anyways, but we've got such a small commercial base that, you know, I personally would be for keeping within the state code. But
Understood.
I'll open it up to questions. Bill?
Just a question, is E2 the way it's written in the state code with the exception of for right-of-way?
Yes.
Does it spell out a straight line
Yes,
to the nearest public sidewalk?
I believe that it does, Councilmember, and
So it would go over pervious, it could possibly go over pervious road. Suppose you had a circuitous front walk coming out of the church or-
getting to the right of way, getting to the public thoroughfare, yes, I agree with that.
So would you follow a straight line distance or the actual
We have-
impervious?
You know, and it's terribly complex, and as far as, it shouldn't be, but it is, and what we have typically tried to do is by the nearest vehicular path, because that's typical, or pedestrian, if it's on a sidewalk, obviously. But you come off of that, you come off of your establishment from that front door, and then the goal is to try and find the nearest either sidewalk or thoroughfare by that straight line, and yes, could that have you walking on the grass? Yes, it could. To get there. But I think the question we were faced with here is now, once you're on that impervious surface, once you get to the school ground, do you then hop off the impervious and go back onto the grass again? And again, in light of there being no clear direction, we yielded to their argument. It made sense, and quite frankly, not yielding would have produced worse consequences for the city than we were comfortable with.
But I think was hearing you were saying that the state guidelines would follow along that, to where they would have to have a pervious surface.
They're consistent with our code, and I think what we need to do is we need to have, and I think you have this from staff already, a fairly consistent application of an interpretation of it, which is what we're going to try to do. So in the future, if we don't change anything, I would still be in favor of what we did with SIP wines, the same exact thing, staying on the impervious roadway until we come to the main entrance.
In my experience, and again, this wasn't, doesn't mean it's right, but I have always seen where the engineers and, you know, they would look for the direct path, the most direct path, but it would have to, as you said, have to be on a sidewalk or a parking area or whatnot. You know, you couldn't jump down through a ditch or, you know,
And of
cross
course-
a field or something like that. It'd have to be what a normal person would walk or, you know, travel by.
And you only get into these questions when it's the close call. I mean, you know, 95% of these don't even impact. We don't have to worry about this sort of line drawing. But SIP Wines brought it to our attention, and we thought we'd better bring it back to you.
Well, I've seen on numerous occasions, people coming out of establishments serving alcohol, they don't necessarily take a straight line exit.
How long is it in there, right?
How is it that a church can get an alcohol beverage license then?
Well, to the extent they wanted at their facility, you know, to me,
There's Catholic Church of Marietta that has an alcohol beverage
Don't be
license.
picking on the Catholic Church, okay?
Yeah, no, is it, no, it's not the St. Joe's, it's another one, the one that Mark just built the big gymnasium and all for.
Well, you're-
Transfiguration, they have an alcohol beverage license.
They
They
have
have-
an on-premise license?
on premise.
Yes, so how do they get that?
The only way I could see is that this code is for their protection, but if they don't want to have the protections of this code and want to say, we're not worried about the setbacks, I suppose they would have the right to do this. I'm not sure how their code is set up. I have seen in some other jurisdictions I work in, they have special event festivals or special event licenses. For instance, the Greek Church will have an annual, some sort of a food festival, and they want to have a permit to serve wine, and we've done that on a special event basis. I have never seen a religious establishment have a permanent on-premise consumption
Right.
pour license.
That's like they operate a bar.
And that must make communion a whole different
They
thing.
think they paid for the new gym.
That's an all-night event.
I do still have a question though, and you brought up the thing here is whether or not a daycare qualifies as a school.
Yes, ma'am.
And the case you gave is a case from 1982, prior to this law that is currently in place, even
Correct.
being enacted with
Correct.
the stipulations that is in it.
Correct.
Is there no new cases? Because
No, and
I still believe a daycare does not qualify as a school if its primary purpose is as a daycare and not as a educational facility that is providing, what is it his here, they have to have a certain number of days you have to attend or else you get kicked out of the school, and it's,
let me do my best on that one, because first of all, let me say this. The case that I provided you all did not cite back to what I believe is the controlling statutory authority, which is 22690, OCJ
22,690 I mean, it's been in the last 5 or 6 years, and this case was a 1982 case.
That's correct. That's correct. The reason I provided the case, though, was just to provide you some case law where the courts were anecdotally talking about, here's the distinction between a daycare and a school. And Councilmember Thurman, I think the court exactly summarized what you just said. You know, it's kind of like obscenity or pornography by the courts. You know, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And what I think the court said is that a daycare's primary function is not to educate. It is to be a caretaker. And while a school's primary function is to educate, well, to me, 22690 perfectly embodies that, because the first element in 22690 is the primary purpose of the institution is to provide education. And it goes through 4 elements. 22690, which is both in the state law and in our code, both say that to define a school versus a daycare, you need to satisfy these 4 elements. Primary purpose has to be education. Institution has to operate on a continuous basis, has to provide instruction at least 180 school days per year, and provide a basic academic educational programming in reading, language arts, mathematics, social studies, and science. If you meet those 4 criteria, I believe not only are you considered a school, but I think that's how you can become available from funding under Peach Care or some of the state funding guidelines for education. And you know, when we were
state guidelines for Peach Care fall not under the educational part of it, but they fall under a more of a child care facility part of it. I don't believe they're actually under because I mean, I don't know if that, for most of the nursery schools, if they have to report what students are there every day and they have to provide 4.5 hours of education facility, they may for one qualified preschool class, but they may not for the other 5 or 6 classes they have that are not qualified pre-kindergarten class.
Right.
So I think we still need clarification on whether or not a daycare, because we have very few places in Milton that we have commercial properties. That happens to be where we happen to have daycares too. So we're going to need clarification on whether or not, every time we got a daycare right on Webb Ridge Road that's not far from where the Aldi and all is, it could very easily, if we're not careful, be within the distance if something went down at the end of that subdivision.
And again, I don't want to name names, but I'm going to. In the situation we had last time, it was the Goddard School, right. And that was a tough one, and I grappled with it a lot, and I could certainly have my opinion changed on that. It just looked like to me, based upon even their own website and sort of the things they held themselves out as, it looked to me like they were attempting to educate and prepare kids for the next level. But I agree with you, and we've not had a lot of experience yet in applying this to daycares, but I can't help but think that if there was a concern that the surveyor had come in and said, I think you're too close to a school, City of Milton, can you give us a yes or no? Is this a school or a daycare? I can't help but believe that between Chris and I and whomever on staff needs to look at that, we could come up with an applicability of this section and decide, because these criteria are fairly exacting. I think that we talked about that, and a lot of things that are daycare are not going to provide mathematics and language arts and reading and social studies and science.
And talks about being suspended for lack of attendance. I don't know of many kids that get suspended from nursery school because they didn't show up.
Well, if anyone could do it, my daughter could find a way. But I can see the point, and we will certainly give the council guidance on that.
Yeah, let me ask, because I know that's an important issue, but that can go separate with this.
Two issues here. First of all,
obviously it's going to come up, and we're going to have to.
Well, two issues. Councilmember Thurman had raised that previously, and it's something that certainly she's entitled, and I want to provide the council guidance on that. The first issue is do you want to go forward with the resolution with respect to adding of right-of-way? If the answer is no, we're comfortable with the code the way it is, we're comfortable with it being consistent with state law, then I need to do no more. I've gotten my guidance and I'm comfortable with that. The second is, let's make sure that when people come in, they know what they're going to be able to expect from Milton on how we interpret what is a school versus what is a daycare, and that we do it correctly, and obviously, consistent with state law.
Well, the reason why I brought it up is in a lot of the resolutions I looked at, or ordinances I looked at from other jurisdictions, they added daycare to that. So they would say school, church, or daycare.
Yes.
Licensed daycare. And so if we're gonna want it to be daycare, I think we need to add daycare to it so that there's no question as far as whether or not that's what our intent is.
And when you say want it, do you mean add it to the things that require the setbacks?
Yes.
Yes, which I don't think, what I'm hearing is you all don't want that, because I think what you're saying is that the space in Milton is such that if you do that, you then basically eviscerate a lot of area for potential economic or commercial development.
But I thought that was, if we're looking at changing the ordinance, if we're gonna change it, if we want daycare in there, let's put it in there. If we don't, then, then hopefully.
I think you're talking the opposite, aren't you, Ken?
Yes, ma'am, yes, sir, I'm not talking that.
Right, I think you're, Ken's saying if you want daycares in there, you don't want to list them. If you want to exclude them, then you list daycare.
If you want to exclude, if you want to have them be one of the things of which you, setback is required
Right.
from, they're
Yes.
specifically included in the ordinance.
Correct.
Right, and that's what we're hearing you say is the opposite, correct? That you don't want to include, or the council
Well,
may
I
not
think
want
we
to
need,
include
I
daycare.
think we need to decide whether or not we do, because if we do want to, prevent establishments from being close to daycares, we need to include them in the ordinance.
Okay. I understand, I guess, but I know what I may have heard from some of y'all. My opinion is, since we're so limited on commercial space, that we may not want to include daycare as a specified as a school and a church.
What I'm hearing right now is the status quo is fine, just make sure that we are interpreting this consistent with state law and we're good. And certainly daycares are not one of our setbacks right now. A pure daycare is not.
So just so I'm clear, if you have a school whose front entrance faces this street over here, and you have a liquor store whose front entrance faces this street over here,
Yes,
and yet the grounds abut one another in the back,
yes.
you're saying that would be permissible as long as they would go out to the street, up the front entrance of the liquor store, up to the street, and around the corner, and back to the front entrance of the school?
That's correct. That's correct. In fact, and one
Yeah, the
attorney.
playground could be right here.
That's correct. And one attorney posed it to me this way. It makes no sense, but it is a formula. And it is a formula set up by state law, and the formula works both ways. Sometimes it's very punitive and would have effects that don't make any sense. In that situation, it would obviously inure to the benefit of the alcohol provider. But it is a formula.
Would you take that as before this last application came and take that map right there and draw how you thought it was calculated to
That's
begin
correct.
with?
Well, you want me to do that now?
Yeah, I mean, just
Get your crayons out.
before, all right, so I got that.
Don't marvel too much at my artistic ability.
Can that be on the camera? We were thinking that it was going like this.
This is
Before.
actually a good example, because I know that everybody can't see, but the formula states that you would come out and go, per what Councilmember Lusk was referring, you'd make that straight line to the nearest public thoroughfare or right-of-way, and then, along this thoroughfare or right-of-way, you would then follow down to the main entrance. Now, where we got in the issue with Sip Wines was the grounds actually came right here, and so we were cutting across the right-of-way to touch the grounds.
Okay.
And their surveyor was saying, no, you need to keep going straight and come in here.
That's what I
And
wanted
that's
to
what
see.
I've always-
Yep, gotcha.
Okay, so right now, it looks like the general consensus is that we leave our ordinance as it is. It matches the state,
Yep.
and we're not going to specifically include daycares in with schools and churches.
That's correct.
Is that, that's what I've heard.
That's what I heard.
Okay. Is there any other discussion on that item? If not, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. And then I want to hear about process.
They will come to the upkeep of bus stops or shelters. So if you don't allow advertising, typically the burden can fall on MARTA
just have to look at the advertising. You just have to look at the advertising.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right. And whether or not that would contribute to the quality of life of the residents that have to drive by it every day.
I would have gone with you, but I just found out, I just did this today like at 4 o'clock.
Then they'll be up. So then it is Alpharetta, it is like that bus stop that's up there at Windward Parkway in front of Lowe's. Is there advertising at that one? Because that's pretty heinous. That rivals South
That's why
Atlanta.
when I saw it on the agenda, I thought, well, let's
It really does.
read about it. I said, I know, I was